I should have listened to the locals when they told me not to hike the Appalachian trails alone. They said the mountains had a way of swallowing people whole, that once you stepped off the beaten path, the woods themselves could turn against you. I laughed it off back then, brushed it aside like some old backwoods superstition. But the truth is, I wasn't laughing when the sun started to dip behind the ridges and the forest swallowed the last of the daylight. The deeper the shadows grew, the quieter everything became. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that presses against your ears, the kind that makes you feel like something's holding its breath. That was when I first heard it. Faint, deliberate, a crunch of leaves that didn't belong to me. I froze, my backpack strap tightening in my grip as I scanned the trees. Nothing moved, but the sound was real. In that moment, every story I'd shrugged off came rushing back, the whispers of things that lived in the hollows, things that could mimic a man's steps, things that stalked you until you begged to be found. And as darkness closed in, I realized I wasn't alone out there. When I first set out that morning, everything seemed perfect. The Appalachian air was crisp and sharp in my lungs, the kind of cold that wakes you up better than any cup of coffee ever could. The trail cut through rolling hills that glowed golden under the late sun, and the trees stood so tall and dense it felt like stepping into another world. I remember thinking how beautiful it all was, how alive the forest felt. It was easy to forget how quickly that beauty could turn against you. I'd been hiking for hours when I noticed the trail markers were gone. At first I thought I'd simply missed one, distracted by the way the light filtered through the branches above. But the path beneath my boots grew thinner, less worn, until it wasn't a path at all anymore, just dirt and roots stretching endlessly ahead. I told myself it was fine, that I could find my way back. My phone had no service, of course, but that didn't surprise me. Out here, the mountains rose like walls, swallowing every signal, every connection to the outside world. That was when I began to feel it, that subtle shift like the woods were watching. The wind had died, leaving only the occasional rustle of something moving far off in the brush. My footsteps seemed louder than they should have been, crunching against the leaves in a way that didn't echo, didn't belong. I stopped once, held my breath, listened. At first there was nothing but silence. Then, faint but clear, came the sound of another step. Not mine. Not a deer's scatter or the scratch of some small animal. This was heavy, measured, human. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and my chest tightened as if the air itself had turned heavier. I spun around, searching the trees, but there was no one there. Only shadows stretched long and deep between the trunks, hiding whatever might have been watching me. I wanted to call out, to break the silence, but some instinct told me not to. Instead, I pulled my backpack closer and forced myself to keep walking, every step echoing the fear that I wasn't the only one on this mountain anymore. I told myself to stay calm, to just backtrack until I found the main trail again. But the longer I tried, the more it felt like the woods were shifting around me. I walked in what I thought was a straight line, only to end up in places I didn't recognize. Gnarled trees with bark twisted like faces, mossy stones that looked too deliberate, as if they'd been placed there. The trail was gone, swallowed up by the forest, and no matter which way I turned, the ridges all looked the same. That's when I heard it, a sound that froze me mid-step. It started faint, almost like someone calling out far in the distance. Not quite human, not quite animal. My brain scrambled to make sense of it, clinging to rationality. Maybe an elk, maybe a bird. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The call rose and fell in strange cadences, stretched syllables that didn't belong to any creature I knew. Then came the whispers. At first I thought it was the wind shifting through the leaves, but no, it was too deliberate, too patterned. Voices, low, hushed, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The sound seemed to move with me, slipping from one side of the trees to the other, always just out of reach. Panic burned in my chest, but I forced myself forward, every muscle in my body screaming to run. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement between the trunks, dark and fast, vanishing the moment my eyes caught it. My heart thundered in my ears. I wasn't imagining it. Something was pacing me, shadowing my steps, never showing itself fully. And then, God, I still remember it clear as day. I thought I heard my own name. Faint, drawn out, carried on the air like a secret. It was my voice, but not mine. Warped. Wrong. That's when the warning I'd laughed at before came crashing back. If you ever hear your name in the woods, don't answer. It's not a person calling you. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep silent. But terror had already rooted itself deep inside me. Whatever was out there, it knew me. It was calling me closer. By the time night fell, I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. The forest seemed to drink in what little light the moon offered, leaving everything cloaked in black. My flashlight beam shook in my trembling hand, bouncing wildly across the trees until it landed on something that stopped me cold. A cabin. It was barely standing, its roof sagging, windows broken out, wood gray with rot. Still in that moment, it looked like salvation. Shelter. A barrier between me and whatever was following me. I hurried inside, shoving the door open against the weight of years. The smell hit me first, damp, mold, and something metallic. Inside, the walls were etched with symbols I didn't recognize, crude carvings of spirals, eyes, and jagged shapes. Animal bones littered the floor, some strung together and hanging from the rafters like charms. It wasn't a place meant for living. It was a place meant for keeping something out. Or maybe keeping it in. Then I heard it, the crunch of leaves outside, slow, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as something circled the cabin. A tap echoed against the wall, light but intentional, followed by another on the opposite side as if it was moving around me. And then, a voice. It was my mother's voice, soft, calling my name the way she used to when I was a kid. For a heartbeat, my body almost obeyed, almost answered back. But the sound cracked at the edges, dragging too long on the syllables, twisting familiar comfort into something that made my skin crawl. One by one, other voices followed. Friends, family, people I hadn't spoken to in years, all layered, circling the cabin, coaxing me to step outside. My knees shook as I pressed my back against the wall, whispering to myself that none of them were real. That was when I understood. This wasn't some animal stalking me. This wasn't even human. It was older than the cabin, older than the carvings, older than anything that walked upright. The Appalachians hadn't grown around it. This thing had been here long before people ever set foot on these mountains. And now, it had found me. The voices outside fell silent all at once, as if some signal had been given. The sudden quiet was worse than the noise. I held my breath, straining to hear anything when the air inside the cabin shifted. It wasn't the door. It wasn't the windows. It was like the walls themselves had allowed something to seep through. The darkness in the far corner thickened, pulsing as if it had weight. My flashlight beam caught nothing but empty air, yet I could feel it, like the trees themselves had stepped inside, bending and twisting into a shape that wanted to resemble a man but couldn't quite hold it. Its outline shimmered, branches, bending where arms should be, bark rippling like flesh. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe until the thing tilted its head toward me. The sound it made wasn't a growl or a hiss. It was the groan of trees in a storm, the rumble of the mountain itself. My body finally broke free of the paralysis and I bolted. The door didn't resist me this time. I crashed into the night, lungs burning, legs pumping blindly through the underbrush. Behind me, I heard it moving, but not in footsteps, more like the forest shifting to follow, the ground and trees bending with it. It wasn't just chasing my body. I could feel it pressing against something deeper, reaching for the part of me that no sprint could protect. My soul felt exposed, as if each desperate breath gave it more of me to claim. Branches whipped my face, roots grabbed at my ankles, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. My heart hammered so violently I thought it might burst. Still, the sense of pursuit never faltered. The thing was everywhere. The shadows, the rustling leaves, the shiver running down my spine. I don't know how. Long I ran before my legs finally gave out, before I stumbled and fell hard against the earth. When I pushed myself up, blinking through tears and sweat, I saw it. Not the thing, but a narrow trail, barely visible, overgrown with weeds and half-buried stones. It looked ancient, forgotten, and in that moment, with nothing left in me but terror, I staggered onto it, praying it might lead me somewhere, anywhere that wasn't here. The trail carried me forward like it wanted me gone. My legs barely worked, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. But somehow I kept moving. The black sky softened to gray, and when the first pale light of dawn bled over the ridges, I stumbled through the last line of trees and collapsed onto gravel. A road. I lay there gasping, the rough stones digging into my palms, too stunned to believe I'd found my way out. The world felt almost unreal, the steady hum of morning birdsong clashing against the nightmare I'd left behind. Headlights cut through the mist, and a truck slowed beside me. The driver jumped out, his face full of shock, questions tumbling from his mouth that I couldn't answer. He helped me into the cab, and as we pulled away, I should have felt safe. But I didn't, because under the growl of the engine I heard it, faint, deliberate, the soft rhythm of footsteps keeping pace with the truck. I pressed my forehead against the glass, eyes searching the trees, but nothing moved. Maybe I escaped. Maybe I didn't. Out here, in these mountains, you never really know if something let you go, or just followed you home. I thought I was prepared for anything. I had my gear packed neatly, maps folded in my bag, and a confidence that came from reading too many survival blogs. A solo camping trip in the Appalachians felt like the escape I needed. Just me, the mountains, and silence. I told myself it would be simple, peaceful even. But standing there with the trees crowding in around me, I didn't realize I wasn't the one doing the watching. The first night should have been uneventful. I set up my tent, lit a small fire, and listened to the forest breathe. For a while it almost felt perfect until the sounds changed. It wasn't the rustle of small animals or the distant cry of an owl. It was heavier, slower, a sound too measured to belong to chance. Leaves crunching just beyond the reach of the firelight. I sat frozen, ears straining, waiting for it to reveal itself. Nothing came forward, but nothing left either. The footsteps would fade, only to return from a different angle, circling. That was when the unease set in. I thought I came here to escape. I didn't know I was walking straight into a hunt. The drive up into the Appalachian backcountry had felt like freedom itself. Winding dirt roads, ridges towering above me, valleys dipping into endless green. It was the kind of view that could swallow every thought in your head. By the time I parked and hiked into the woods, the weight of the world felt far behind me. The forest stretched wide and endless, its silence pressing against my ears like a comfort I didn't know I needed. For a while I believed this trip would be exactly what I had hoped for. Just me, the trees, and nothing else. I found a small clearing not far from a stream, just big enough to pitch my tent. Setting up felt almost ritualistic. Poles snapped, into place canvas stretched tight, fire pit lined with rocks. The forest towered above me, ancient and patient, as if it had seen thousands of campers like me come and go. But as the hours slipped by, something in the air shifted. At first I couldn't place it. Then I realized it was the quiet. There were no birds, no cicadas, no chorus of insects that should have been screaming by late afternoon. Just the whisper of leaves high above, as if even the smallest creatures had chosen to stay hidden. I tried to shake it off, but then I noticed the trees. A few trunks near the edge of the clearing bore strange marks, slashes carved deep into the bark, uneven and jagged. Not the work of an animal, not neat enough to be a surveyor's cut. Just wrong. As the sky dimmed and shadows stretched long, I forced myself to light a fire. The flicker of flame pushed the darkness back a little, but not far enough. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, circling just beyond the firelight. My heart kicked against my ribs as I gripped the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the tree line. Nothing. The sound stopped, swallowed by the silence. I sat back down, pulse racing, telling myself it was a deer, maybe a stray hiker. Then the steps came again. From the other side this time. Slow, intentional. Whoever or whatever it was moving around me, watching. I barely slept that first night, every rustle outside my tent tightening my chest until exhaustion finally dragged me under. By morning, the forest seemed calmer, almost normal. The fire pit smoldered faintly. The trees stood in their silent ranks, and the footsteps from the night before felt like a dream I'd overfed with paranoia. That was what I told myself anyway. I packed light and set out, deciding I'd hike, back toward the main trail. The sooner I was out of these woods, the better. But no matter how far I walked, nothing looked familiar. The narrow paths twisted back on themselves, looping into places I swore I hadn't been. Tree after tree bore strange scars, marks etched into the bark, too erratic to be natural, too rough to be carved by human hands with care. That was when the calls began. It started as a whistle, faint and sharp like someone trying to draw my attention. I spun around, expecting to see another hiker. No one. I kept walking, faster now, but the sound followed, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind. The pitch shifted, too smooth, too fluid, gliding from high to low in ways no bird could mimic. Then came the shadows. At first I thought they were tricks of light, but they moved with purpose, slipping between trees just at the edge of my vision. Whenever I turned to catch them, the forest was empty, still as stone. Yet I could feel it. That unmistakable sensation of being paced, tracked like prey. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, and I remembered something an old man at a gas station had muttered when I told him where I was headed. His words had sounded half like a warning, half like a joke at the time. If the woods go quiet, it's because something wants to hear you instead. The silence fell suddenly, heavy and absolute. No insects, no birds, not even the sound of branches moving in the breeze. The woods weren't listening to me, they were listening for me. And in that silence I knew. I wasn't lost by accident. I'd been led here. That night the truth hit me. Whatever was out here wasn't just wandering, it was hunting. I woke to the faint rasp of fabric moving against metal. At first I thought it was a dream, but when I opened my eyes I saw the zipper of my tent trembling, inching downward as if unseen fingers were working it slowly. I held my breath, waiting for a face to appear in the gap. But there was nothing, just the whisper of nylon against teeth. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I forced myself to crawl out with my flashlight clutched like a weapon. The beam swept across the clearing, catching something pale on the ground. Bones, small ones, animal bones, picked clean and laid out in a deliberate shape, a spiral that coiled into itself. My stomach turned. This wasn't the work of scavengers. This was arranged, left for me. That was when I heard it, the whispers. At first they were faint, like the breeze moving through branches, but then words began to take form. Some were voices I recognized. My mother calling my name, a friend's laugh, even my own voice echoing back at me. Other whispers spoke in a tongue I didn't know, guttural, old, carrying a rhythm that felt wrong. They circled me, growing, louder, threading through the trees like the forest itself was speaking. I spun, flashlight darting, searching for the source. That's when I saw it. Between two pines not 10 yards away, something stood. Tall, too tall, its limbs crooked and long, its body fused with the shadows so that it almost looked like bark come alive. Its face, if it had one, was blurred, shifting with the texture of the trees behind it. Yet I could feel its gaze locking onto me, studying me the way a predator sizes up prey. I couldn't move. My legs locked as if the forest itself was holding me in place. The thing didn't lunge, it didn't attack, it just lingered, watching, waiting. And that's when the realization sunk in, deeper than the fear in my bones. It wasn't chasing me blindly. It was hurting me. Every step, every sound, every whisper was part of a game. I wasn't lost in the woods. I was being led deeper into them. I couldn't stay another second in that camp. The tent, the bones, the whispers. All of it felt like a trap closing in. I grabbed my pack, barely zipped it, and bolted into the night. My flashlight swung wildly, catching only fragments of the forest as I stumbled over roots and rocks, every step louder than I wanted it to be. But no matter how fast I ran, the forest twisted itself around me. Trails I thought I knew curved into dead ends. Trees leaned in like a living wall, branches clawing at my arms, snagging my clothes. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, reshaping into a labyrinth meant to swallow me whole. And behind me, or maybe ahead, I could feel it, that thing, moving faster than anything had a right to. Sometimes I'd catch the thud of a footfall, sometimes the crack of a branch snapping, but always just far enough to stay hidden. Yet every so often I'd see a flicker in the dark, the impression of something tall slipping between the trees, always ahead, always waiting. It wasn't just chasing me. It was inside me. I could feel its presence gnawing at my thoughts, whispering doubts, seeding terror. My body was hunted, yes, but my soul felt like the real prey. Every time my heartbeat rose, it was as though it fed, growing stronger, closer. I don't know how long I ran before my legs buckled, sending me crashing to the ground. When I pushed myself up, gasping for air, I saw it, an outline in the gloom, a structure. Small, crooked, half swallowed by vines and moss. A shack. Staggering forward, I pushed the rotting door open, its hinges shrieking like a warning. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Old tools hung on the walls, rusted saws, broken traps, the remnants of a life that had long since bled out of this place. But what froze me wasn't the tools. It was the carvings. Etched deep into the wooden beams were messages, scratched over and over again in frantic, uneven hands. Some were warnings, others desperate prayers. But one line repeated more than any other, gouged so deep into the wood it seemed to bleed. Don't run. It follows faster. By the time the first gray streaks of dawn touched the horizon, I was no longer running. I was stumbling, half delirious, dragging myself through the undergrowth like something half dead. My legs gave out more times than I could count, but the thought of stopping was worse than the pain. Then, as if the forest finally decided to spit me out, I broke through a wall of thorns and collapsed onto gravel. A road. I barely lifted my head before I heard the distant hum of an engine. Tires crunched, brakes hissed, and then a man's voice cut through the haze. He jumped out asking if I was okay, but all I could do was mutter, Don't let it take me back." He didn't understand. He just helped me into his truck. As we pulled away, I dared one last glance out the back window. The trees stood silent, endless, their shadows stretching like claws. And there, at the very edge where the forest met the light, a figure stood, tall, still, watching. I'll never know if I escaped that night or if it only let me go. But I do know one thing: the Appalachians never forget who enters their domain. I've always believed the wilderness could heal me, that if I got far enough away from the chaos of the world, I'd find silence, clarity, maybe even myself. That belief is what pushed me deep into the Appalachian backcountry, alone, carrying only a backpack and the confidence that I could handle solitude. I'd hiked before, I'd camped alone. I told myself I was prepared. But the Appalachians are not just wilderness. They are older than belief itself, older than any of us can comprehend. From the moment I set up camp on that first night, I felt the weight of something pressing against me. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, like the forest had swallowed every sound just to listen more closely. Every snapped twig in the dark made my stomach twist. Every gust of wind carried with it the suggestion of whispers. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just nerves. Just my mind filling the void. But deep down, a truth settled like ice in my bones. I came out here searching for peace. What I found, instead, was the feeling of being watched. The Appalachians don't give without taking something back. When I first reached the clearing where I planned to camp, I couldn't help but stop and just stare. The mountains towered around me, layered one after another until they faded into a misty horizon. The trees stretched skyward like endless pillars, their crowns weaving together into a cathedral of green. It didn't feel like stepping into the wilderness. It felt like stepping into something older, something sacred. For a moment, I actually felt awe. The air was sharp with pine, the soil damp beneath my boots. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. Silence, solitude, the comfort of being swallowed whole by nature. I unpacked, set up my tent, gathered wood, moving through the familiar motions to steady myself. But no matter how I tried to settle in, a tightness clung to me, like a shadow trailing every step. It took me a while to notice what was missing. No birds, no insects, not even the distant chatter of a squirrel in the brush. The forest was still, too still, and the silence pressed against my ears until I found myself straining for any sound at all. That's when I noticed the trees. Some of their trunks were scarred with strange, deliberate markings, spirals, slashes, shapes that didn't look like any animal's doing. I told myself they were just remnants from hunters, maybe bored campers with knives. But the way the lines cut deep, precise, almost ritualistic, they unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Night fell. The forest grew darker than I expected. My small fire seemed swallowed by the trees, its glow fighting against the black. I lay in my tent listening to the hollow silence, forcing myself to breathe evenly. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They circled the perimeter of my camp, crunching softly over leaves, never quick, never panicked, just measured, patient. My chest tightened as I gripped the zipper of my tent, yanked it open, and shone my light into the trees. Nothing. Only trunks and shadows. I tried to laugh it off, crawl back inside, but no sooner had I closed my eyes than the sound began again, closer this time. Something out there was walking, and it wanted me to know. Morning should have brought relief, but it didn't. I unzipped the tent, expecting sunlight to chase away the heaviness of the night. But the woods looked different. Like they had shifted while I slept. The air was damp, colder, and the sky above was pale, a washed-out gray. I told myself I was just shaken from lack of sleep, that my mind was exaggerating the unease. Still, I packed quickly, eager to move, convinced that walking back toward the trailhead would settle me. But as I hiked, my confidence began to unravel. The landmarks I remembered, the crooked oak near the bend, the split boulder by the ridge, weren't where they should have been. The path twisted in ways I didn't recall, and markers I swore I'd passed on the way in were simply gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed them overnight, rearranging itself while I slept. Then came the whistles. At first I thought it was wind funneling through the trees, but no. The sound was too sharp, too deliberate. A rising and falling note, almost like a bird call, yet strained, off-kilter, unnatural. It echoed again, closer. A second whistle answered, lower, broken, like someone trying to mimic an animal, and failing. I stopped dead, gripping the straps of my pack, listening. That's when I noticed movement in the corner of my vision, flickers of shadow darting just beyond the edges of sight. I turned sharply, scanning the underbrush, but each time I looked there was nothing. And yet, the feeling persisted, that something was keeping pace with me, always a few steps off, gliding parallel through the trees. The silence thickened. Even the odd whistles ceased, and the forest fell into a suffocating hush. The kind of silence that presses into your ears, demanding you notice it. That's when I remembered a warning I'd once heard from locals in a small Appalachian town. If the woods go quiet, it's because something wants to hear you instead. The memory chilled me more than the cold air. Standing there in that silence, every breath I took felt amplified, every shuffle of my boots like a shout. I didn't just feel watched anymore. I felt listened to, and whatever was out there was waiting for me to make the next sound. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the trees felt like a footstep, every gust of wind like a breath against the fabric of my tent. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't for long. A sound snapped me awake, the faint zip, zip of my tent door being tugged. My heart lurched so violently I thought it might tear through my chest. I froze, eyes wide in the darkness, ears straining. The zipper inched down, then stopped. For a moment, all I heard was the rasp of my own breath. With trembling hands, I flicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the nylon, spilling light outside as I ripped open the flap. Nothing. No one stood there. Just the same endless woods, swaying quietly in the night breeze. But then my light caught something in the dirt. Bones. Small animal bones scattered in a deliberate arrangement. Spirals, lines, shapes that looked almost like symbols carved into the earth. They hadn't been there before. The whispers began next. They seeped from the trees, low at first, rising like a tide. Some carried my name, spoken in voices I recognized, my brother, an old friend. But when I whipped around, the tone would shift, twisting into strange syllables, dialects I couldn't place. It wasn't language as much as imitation, like something trying to wear human speech as a mask. I clutched my flashlight tighter, sweeping it over the tree line. That's when I saw it. Tall, distorted, a shape that was almost human, but stretched, warped. Its body seemed to melt into the bark, its limbs long and angular like broken branches. For a split second I thought it was a tree, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately, watching. The beam trembled in my grip, and before I could react, the figure stepped back into the shadows, gone as if it had never been. I realized then I wasn't just lost. I wasn't just unlucky. I was being herded. Every step I'd taken, every wrong turn on the trail, it had been steering me deeper. And tonight, it had come close enough to remind me that escape was no longer my choice. I wasn't surviving the forest. I was surviving whatever owned it. I couldn't take it anymore. Staying in camp felt like lying in an open grave, waiting for the dirt to be shoveled over me. I grabbed my pack, half zipped, half empty, and ran into the night. The forest was merciless. Branches clawed at my arms, roots snagged my feet. The ground itself seemed to shift beneath me. What had been familiar paths by daylight now twisted into endless looping corridors. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow stretched too long. I wasn't just lost. I was trapped inside a maze that kept rewriting itself around me. And it was with me. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how far, it was always there. Just ahead, just behind, just beyond the corner of my sight. I'd hear a twig snap to my left, then a whistle on my right, then the sickening hush of silence falling over everything at once. My lungs burned, but the fear in me was deeper than flesh. It felt like something was reaching past my body, into the marrow of who I was, sniffing out my soul like a predator. At one point I collapsed against a tree, chest heaving, lightheaded from panic. That's when I saw it again. Through the blur of branches, a silhouette standing impossibly still, yet somehow closer than before. I stumbled onward, delirious, until the woods opened up just enough to reveal it, a shack. Half collapsed, swallowed by vines, its timbers rotting but still upright. My legs carried me inside before I could even think. The smell hit first. Mildew, rust, something older beneath. Crude tools lay scattered. Traps, knives dulled to useless. Edges, scraps of old hunting gear. And then my light caught the carvings. The walls were scarred with words, gouged deep as if written by shaking hands. Don't run. Another lower down. It follows faster. The warnings weren't random. They were desperate. Pleas from whoever had come here before me, whoever had thought this shack might be safe. My stomach turned cold as I traced the grooves with my fingers, realizing I wasn't the first to be hunted, and something told me I wouldn't be the last. Behind me, the wood groaned as if something pressed against the shack from the outside. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, I was barely moving, stumbling more than walking. My body had gone numb, running on instinct alone, when the trees finally broke open and I spilled out onto a dirt road. Gravel bit into my palms as I collapsed, gasping like a drowning man who'd breached the surface. I don't know how long I lay there before the sound of an engine rose in the distance. A truck slowed, brakes squealing, and a man leaned out, calling to me. I must have looked like hell, mud-caked, clothes torn, eyes wide and wild, but he pulled me up without question and laid me across the worn seat. Relief should have come then. Safety. Escape. But as the truck rattled forward, I couldn't stop myself from looking back. Through the blur of trees just before the bend took the forest out of sight, I saw it. A figure, tall and still, standing at the tree line. Watching. My rescuer didn't see it. Maybe no one ever would. I'll never know if I truly escaped that night, or if it only let me go. The Appalachians don't forget, and neither does what hunts inside them. I should have known better than to come here alone. The Appalachians aren't just mountains, they're ancient, endless, and heavy with secrets older than memory itself. I told myself I was here for solitude, for the quiet kind of adventure. People chase when the world feels too loud. But from the very first step off the road, I could tell something was wrong. The forest didn't greet me with birdsong or the rustle of wildlife. Instead, it swallowed every sound, leaving me with nothing but the crunch of my boots and the thrum of my own heartbeat. The trees loomed impossibly tall, their branches clawing at the gray sky as if they wanted to trap me beneath them. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was just unsettled by the silence, but deep down I felt it. Like unseen eyes were watching from the shadows, tracking every move. I thought I was just hiking through history, walking paths carved long before me. But history here doesn't rest. Some places in these mountains were left behind for a reason, and before long I would learn the truth. The Appalachians don't forget, and sometimes they don't forgive. The first few miles of my hike felt like stepping into another world. The mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks dissolving into low clouds that clung to the sky. The air was crisp, cool in a way that made every breath sting with a strange clarity. I told myself this was exactly what I came for, the untouched wilderness, the kind of silence you couldn't find anywhere else. But even in that silence, something gnawed at me. The forest stretched endlessly, the trees older and taller than anything I'd seen before, their bark scarred and twisted as if they'd been holding secrets for centuries. At first, I convinced myself the quiet was peaceful, but the more I listened, the more wrong it felt. No chirping birds, no buzzing insects, no scurry of small animals in the brush. Just my footsteps echoing in a place that felt too vast to ever truly belong to me. That's when I noticed the carvings. Small, deliberate marks etched into the bark of certain trees. At first, I thought they were just old scars, maybe signs, left by hunters or hikers long before me. But the shapes were strange, looping symbols that didn't look natural or accidental. I shook it off, telling myself not to overthink, but unease was already pressing into me. Even the trails seemed to shift beneath my eyes. Landmarks didn't match the map I carried. A fallen log I swore I hadn't passed before now blocked my way, and paths that should have been clear looked swallowed by growth. By the time the sun began to sink behind the ridges, painting the forest in fading orange light, I was fighting the prickling thought that I wasn't alone. And then I saw it, a narrow, crooked trail splitting off from the one I followed. It wasn't marked, wasn't on the map, and yet it pulled at me like gravity itself. I should have ignored it. I should have set up camp, stayed where I was safe. But something about that path, it felt like it was waiting for me. Against every better instinct, I stepped off the map and into the darkening woods, following a trail no one had marked. At least, not for me. The crooked trail wound downhill, weaving through thickets until the trees parted into a small valley. And that's when I saw it. A village forgotten and swallowed by the forest. Cabins leaned in crooked rows, their roofs sagging, their chimneys crumbled into rubble, but they hadn't been reclaimed entirely. It was as if time itself had hesitated here, leaving everything in a state of half decay, half preservation. I froze at the sight, my breath clouding in the stillness. There was no sound, no wind threading through branches, no rustle of leaves. Just an oppressive weight in the air, thick with rot and damp earth. I told myself I'd stumbled across some old settlement, one of those ghost towns whispered about in Appalachian lore. But the longer I stared, the more it felt wrong. Too intact. Too deliberate. Curiosity pulled me forward. The cabins formed a circle, all facing inward toward a single stone well at the center, as though whatever mattered most here wasn't the homes, but what the well held. I avoided it at first, circling the outskirts, until I worked up the courage to step into one of the houses. Inside, dust clung to everything like skin, yet there were details that unsettled me more than the decay. Children's shoes lined neatly by the door. A wooden table still set with plates, food long since molded into shapeless husks. It was as if the people had stood up in the middle of a meal and simply never returned. I ran my fingers along the walls, noticing scratches, no carvings, etched just beneath the window frame. More of those strange looping symbols, the same as I'd seen on the trees. My chest tightened. This place wasn't just abandoned. It had been left behind with purpose. That's when I heard it. Faint, distant, carried on no wind at all. A sound, like laughter. High-pitched, fleeting, impossible to tell if it belonged to a child or something imitating one. My blood iced over. I spun, scanning the doorway, the windows, the forest beyond. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. But I swear, in that hollow silence, the laughter lingered, as though the village itself was remembering something I wasn't meant to hear. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridges, shadows swallowing the valley, I knew I couldn't hike back out. The forest trail had already twisted on me once, and stumbling blind through it at night would have been suicide. Against every instinct screaming in my chest, I chose one of the sturdier cabins to hole up in until morning. The air inside was colder than outside, carrying a smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. I unrolled my sleeping bag near the corner, trying not to think about the abandoned shoes by the door, or the way the windows seemed to stare outward like watchful eyes. At first it was quiet, oppressively so. Then the silence broke, a faint creak like weight pressing on a floorboard. Not inside this cabin, but just outside. My heart pounded as footsteps shuffled past the door, slow and deliberate before fading. Moments later, another sound. Wood, groaning, as if a door to one of the other cabins had opened on its own. I edged toward the cracked window and dared a glance. That's when I saw them. Figures. Pale, indistinct, drifting between the houses with slow, gliding steps. They gathered in loose circles around the stone well, their shapes wavering in the moonlight as though half there, half not. I ducked back, throat dry. My ears rang with whispers. Low, overlapping voices carried through the walls, though I couldn't make out the words. Then came the movement inside. A chair scraped across the floor behind me, though I hadn't touched it. I spun, pulse thundering, only for the cabin door to slam shut with a violence that rattled the hinges. I backed into the corner, every nerve screaming, when something colder than air brushed my ankle. Slowly I looked down. From beneath the bed came a whisper, so soft I nearly convinced myself I imagined it, until it spoke again, clear as a knife sliding through silence. "We're still here." The voice was that of a child. Sweet, fragile, and absolutely wrong in a place like this. I froze, staring at the black gap beneath the bed frame, waiting for movement, for a hand, for a face. But all I could see was darkness, stretching deeper than it should. I couldn't stay in that cabin another second. My legs carried me before I even realized I'd made the choice, bursting through the door and into the night air. The pale moonlight coated the village in silver. But instead of clarity, it only deepened the nightmare. Every direction I turned, every path I took, I found myself back at the same place, the stone well at the center. It loomed like a black heart, drawing me in no matter how far I tried to run. The figures were everywhere now, no longer just shapes, in the distance, but drifting closer, their pale faces stretched long and hollow. They whispered constantly, a language I couldn't understand, low syllables rising and falling like a chant. The air around me pulsed with it, vibrating in my chest. Panicked, I stumbled into a larger structure, its steeple leaning, its roof half collapsed. A church. The door groaned open under my weight, and I fell inside. The air reeked of dust and candle wax long extinguished. The walls were covered in carvings, hundreds of them. Some were symbols, jagged and desperate, overlapping one another as though carved in frantic haste. Others were words, scratched deep into the wood with shaking hands. Warnings, pleas, prayers. Keep them away. Don't drink from it. God forgive us. I crept toward the altar, where a leather-bound journal lay open, brittle pages, curling at the edges. I flipped through, scanning entries written in a tight, hurried script, accounts of strange figures, voices in the trees, the well at the center of it all. My chest tightened as I reached the final page. The writing was almost illegible, scratched into the paper so hard it nearly tore through. Only 2 lines stood clear. Don't look at the well. Don't answer when they call your name. The words burned into me. My skin prickled as though the writer was reaching across time to warn me personally. And then, soft but unmistakable, I heard it. My name, whispered through the church door, drawn out slowly, almost tenderly. I froze, every muscle taut. My eyes locked on the door as the whisper came again, closer this time, carrying a promise that if I answered, whatever waited outside would finally step in. By the time dawn broke, I was more ghost than man. My body moved without thought, stumbling through brush and bramble, driven only by the desperate need to escape. And then, just as the first rays of sun lit the treetops, I broke free of the forest. My boots hit gravel, and I collapsed onto an old logging road, lungs burning, throat raw. I lay there for what felt like hours, drinking in the open sky like it was salvation. A passing truck finally slowed, the driver leaning out, eyes wide at the sight of me. He asked if I was all right, but I could barely answer. He gave me water, hauled me into the cab, and carried me away from that place. Later, once I'd recovered enough to speak, I asked about the village hidden in the valley. Every local I pressed gave me the same answer. A puzzled shake of the head, a frown, a muttered dismissal. Ain't no village out there, one old man finally told me, voice firm. Not anymore. But I know what I saw. And when I close my eyes at night, I still hear them whisper my name. Some places in the Appalachians aren't abandoned. They're waiting. I told myself I just needed one quiet night. One night away from the noise, the routines, the endless pull of the world. That's how I ended up in the Appalachians with nothing but a backpack, a flashlight, and the keys to a cabin that hadn't seen guests in years. It looked harmless enough when I arrived. Weathered wood, a sagging roofline, and a porch that creaked under my boots. But the silence around it unsettled me. No birds, no insects, no rustle of life in the trees. Just stillness, so heavy it pressed against my chest. The locals had warned me. An old man at the gas station narrowed his eyes when I mentioned the cabin, muttering something about not staying past dark. A woman behind him shook her head, whispering, "Some places up there don't forget who comes through." I laughed, it off, eager for solitude, but their words followed me as I hauled my gear inside. Looking back, I should have listened. I thought I was just spending one night in an old cabin, letting the mountains cradle me in silence. I didn't realize I'd be inviting something else, something patient enough to wait by the window. The drive into the mountains had already unsettled me. The Appalachians rise up like ancient giants, ridges rolling endlessly, their peaks dissolving into mist. The deeper I went, the narrower the roads became until they were little more than dirt tracks weaving through forests so dense the sunlight barely touched the ground. There's a kind of beauty here, untamed, raw, and almost sacred, but it comes with a weight, a hush that feels older than anything I've known. When I finally reached the cabin, it stood alone in a small clearing, its roof bowed but not broken, its wooden frame weathered yet stubbornly holding. As I stepped onto the porch, the boards groaned, and for a moment it felt like the cabin itself was exhaling, waking up after years of silence. The windows reflected the forest behind me, and I had the uneasy sense they weren't reflecting, at all, but watching. Inside, it was simple. A single room, A cot against the wall, a stove, shelves of dust. Peaceful in its way, until I noticed the details. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no chirring insects, nothing. On the porch, rail. Faint claw marks dragged through the wood as though something had sharpened itself there. Hanging from nearby branches, I spotted small charms, twisted bundles of sticks and string tied in strange patterns. I told myself it was superstition. Maybe hunters, maybe kids. Mountain folk had their ways, their protections. Still, the longer I stayed, the heavier the silence became, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it. I set down my pack, lit a lantern, and told myself this was what I came for. Quiet, isolation, no distractions. But when the sun began to sink, the air grew colder, thicker. The shadows stretched long and dark, and every tree seemed to lean closer to the clearing, as though the forest itself was watching me now. By the time the last light slipped behind the ridges, the weight of it was undeniable. The silence wasn't peace anymore. It was expectation. It felt like the woods were waiting. Night came fast in the mountains. One moment the trees were painted gold by the last smear of sunset, and the next the clearing was swallowed in blackness so complete it felt like the world had ended beyond the lantern's glow. Inside the cabin, the shadows stretched across the walls, shifting with the flicker of the flame, making it seem like something moved just outside my vision. The silence was no longer just silence. It was pressure, heavy and unnatural. Every instinct screamed that something should be making noise, an owl, a cricket, even the rustle of leaves. Instead, the woods seemed to hold their breath, and I could hear the blood rushing in my own ears. Then it started. A sharp crack echoed from somewhere deep among the trees, wood snapping underfoot. I froze, straining to listen, but nothing followed. Minutes later, a long, thin whistle drifted through the dark. Not a bird call, not the wind. Too deliberate. By midnight, I was sitting upright on the cot, every muscle taut. That's when I heard it. A voice. Faint, almost playful. A child's whisper, right outside the window. It said my name. My skin crawled. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. It had to be in my head. Exhaustion, paranoia, the mind inventing what it feared most. I told myself that over and over, but then it came again, clearer this time, and it wasn't alone. More whispers joined in, overlapping, circling. One outside the door, another at the back wall. They weren't speaking words I could understand, just soft syllables, broken laughter, and the occasional unmistakable sound of my own name. I gripped the lantern so hard my hands ached, waiting for a face to press against the glass. When I finally forced myself to look, heart pounding, there was nothing. Just the cabin window reflecting my own terrified stare, and beyond that, endless dark. But the feeling didn't leave. The dark pressed close against the glass, thick and alive, as though something waited just beyond my sight, smiling where I couldn't see. The whispers never stopped. They rose and fell like waves, sometimes soft as breath against the glass, sometimes sharp enough to make me flinch. At first they only said my name, but soon they changed. Some begged me to come outside, voices trembling like they were desperate for help. Others mocked me, laughing low and cruel, dragging out syllables until they no longer sounded human. And then came the ones that cut deepest, voices that sounded like people I knew. My brother. My mother. Old friends I hadn't spoken to in years. Each voice perfect, flawless, impossible. I shoved the table against the door, stacked chairs under the windows, anything to create a barrier between me and whatever was outside. But the cabin itself seemed to turn against me. The floorboards groaned with heavy steps that weren't mine. The shutters rattled as though fingers dragged across them. Once the door swelled inward, hinges squealing, as if something pushed from the other side. Every creak made my throat tighten, but nothing compared to what I saw when I finally dared peek through the cracks. Out there between the trees, pale shapes shifted in the dark. They were too thin, their limbs too long, their heads tilting at strange angles, cocked as if they were listening. Dozens of them, just standing, waiting. The voices outside swelled, together, no longer whispers but a chant. A rhythm that rolled through the clearing, low and steady, each line ending with my name. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't matter. The sound vibrated in my bones, crawling under my skin. I wanted to believe I could wait it out, that dawn would scatter them. But the night stretched endlessly, the lantern sputtering, lower, shadows swelling in every corner. My body begged for sleep, yet every time my eyes drifted shut, a sudden laugh or sharp whisper jolted me awake. Hours dragged by in a blur of terror. I don't know how I kept breathing, how my heart didn't just give out right there on the floor. All I knew was that something was out there, watching, calling, wearing the voices of everyone I loved like masks. And it wanted me. Desperation drove me to the fireplace. My hand shook as I stacked the brittle logs, striking the matches until one finally caught. The flames roared to life, filling the cabin with a flickering orange glow. For a moment I let myself believe the light would be enough, that fire might push back whatever pressed against the walls outside. But the opposite happened. The voices swelled, layered and overlapping, so close I swore they came from just beyond. The firelight, or worse, inside the room with me. I froze when I heard it. A whisper from directly behind my chair. I spun around, but the room was empty, shadows swaying with the flames. My chest tightened as another voice hissed my name from the corner, and then another from the ceiling rafters. The whispers weren't outside anymore. They were in here. I scrambled for my phone, desperate to hear another human voice, but the screen flickered once and died in my hand. The clock above the door had stopped too, its hands frozen at midnight. It felt like the world beyond these. Walls had gone silent, leaving me trapped in this nightmare outside of time. That's when I noticed the floorboard near the hearth, pried loose and barely covered. Inside was a thin leather-bound journal, its pages stained and brittle. My hands trembled as I opened it, scanning the frantic handwriting. Warnings scrawled over and over. Don't answer them. Don't look in their eyes. They'll keep calling until you do. Each page grew more frantic. Letters pressed deeper into the paper until the final entry broke off mid-sentence. They're at my window. I slammed the book shut just as the glass beside me shivered violently, rattling in its frame. The fire popped, casting long shadows across the walls. And then came the sound that nearly stopped my heart. 3 sharp knocks. Slow, deliberate. From the window, inches from where I sat, the flames hissed and guttered as if the air itself recoiled. I pressed my back against the far wall, pulse hammering in my ears, every instinct screaming not to look. But the glass quivered again, and a low whisper bled through the wood. This time, it wasn't just my name. It was my voice. By the time dawn bled across the treetops, the voices were gone. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, leaving behind nothing but silence, and not the suffocating silence of the night, but the gentle stillness of morning. I staggered outside, the forest bathed in golden light, birdsong filling the air, as though it had never been missing. The cabin behind me looked ordinary now, almost peaceful, as if the horrors of the night had been a dream. But I knew better. I didn't linger. I followed the trail until I stumbled onto an old logging road, and I never once looked back. Later that day, I tried telling the locals what had happened, searching for answers. They wouldn't meet my eyes. An old woman finally muttered, "That cabin hasn't had anyone in it for years." Another leaned closer, voice low. "If you hear them once, they'll keep following." That night, safe in my own bed miles away, I convinced myself it was over. But sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of knuckles brushing glass. 3 slow, deliberate knocks at my bedroom window. Some voices don't stay in the mountains, they follow you home. I went camping alone deep in the Appalachian mountains because I thought I needed silence. The kind of silence that can't be found in towns or highways. The kind that makes you feel like the world has finally stopped spinning for just a moment. At least that's what I told myself when I packed up and ignored the uneasy looks from the locals. More than one person told me not to camp out there after dark. They said the mountains held things that didn't take kindly to strangers. Creatures, voices, shadows. I laughed it off. Folklore, old campfire stories meant to keep kids from wandering too far. But the second I pitched my tent in a small clearing, something in the air felt wrong. Not dangerous at first, just unsettling. I realized I couldn't hear a single bird. No crickets. No rustling of animals in the brush. The quiet pressed down on me, heavy, almost deliberate, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I told myself I was imagining it, but the truth lingered in the back of my mind. I came here searching for peace. Instead, I found myself listening to silence that felt alive. Silence waiting. Silence watching. I set up camp in a small clearing. I had found off the trail, a pocket of flat ground surrounded by towering pines and ridges that rose like jagged teeth in every direction. The Appalachians are beautiful in their own haunting way. Layers of green rolling into misty blue, shadows stretching for miles, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine sap. But as I hammered in the last stake of my tent, I couldn't shake the sense that this beauty was also a kind of warning. Out here, the wilderness didn't care if I was welcome or not. My tent looked pitifully small against the enormity of the forest. A flimsy nylon shell between me and everything I couldn't see, everything I couldn't understand. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was being dramatic, but the feeling lingered like a weight pressing on my chest. Then I noticed the tree. At first, I thought the bark was just weathered, but no. It was slashed, clawed into long, unnatural grooves that dug deep, too precise to be storm damage. Nearby, dangling from the branches, were strange woven charms made of twigs and knotted string. Some were hanging low, close enough to brush against my shoulder when I walked past. I stood there for a long moment, staring, trying to make sense of them. Folk art? Kids playing a prank? The silence didn't help. No birds, no insects, not even the faint scamper of a squirrel. Just nothing. I forced a laugh that sounded too loud in the stillness. Guess the forest has a weird sense of decoration, I muttered to myself, trying to brush it off. By the time the sun began to sink, the ridges cast long shadows across the clearing, swallowing what little light I had left. The forest around me seemed to shift with a darkness, the stillness tightening, suffocating. I zipped my tent shut, telling myself I'd be fine. But the woods outside felt like they were waiting for something, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger that feeling grew, that my laughter hadn't fooled anything out there. The night thickened around me like a blanket I couldn't shake off. Inside my tent, the silence pressed in from every direction, heavy and unnatural. I tried to distract myself with the glow of my lantern, flipping through a book I'd brought, but every creak of the forest seemed amplified, like the trees were leaning closer, listening. Sometime after midnight I heard it, the faint snap of a branch. Not the kind that breaks under its own weight, but sharp, purposeful, like a footstep. I held my breath, ears straining. Then came another sound. A long, thin whistle that carried through the trees. It wasn't a bird call. It was too measured, too deliberate. The kind of sound meant to be heard. I told myself it was the wind, but the thought didn't sit right. Sleep came in restless fragments until something pulled me from it. A sound so close, so deliberate, it froze me in place. Knock. Slow, heavy, against the side of my tent. I felt my blood run cold, every muscle locked. Maybe it was an animal, I thought desperately, a deer brushing against the fabric. But then it came again, knock, rhythmic this time, spaced apart, steady, like knuckles on a door. I couldn't move. The nylon wall between me and whatever stood outside felt thinner than paper. And then, my name, whispered, soft, dragging through the syllables like someone savoring them. So close I swore I felt the breath push through the fabric. My lungs burned as I tried not to breathe. My shaking hand hovered near the zipper, but I didn't dare pull it. I didn't want to see what might be waiting. The silence stretched, broken, only by the frantic beat of my heart. I pressed my palms over my ears, but I couldn't shut it out. The whisper of my name again, this time from a different side of the tent. I clenched my eyes shut, praying for dawn. But the knocking. It never stopped. The knocking didn't fade. It grew bolder, circling my tent like something was testing the thin fabric, searching for a way inside. Each thud landed in a new place, behind my head, near my feet, just inches from my shoulder. I sat frozen, clutching the flashlight in my hand, too terrified to switch it on. A beam of light felt like an invitation, like if I acknowledged them, they'd have permission to step closer. The whispers multiplied. At first they were faint, scattered, like voices caught in the wind, but soon they layered over one another, weaving into an eerie chorus. Some sounded high-pitched, childlike, tugging at me with false innocence. Others were deep, distorted, mocking in their tone. And then, worst of all, I heard voices I recognized, my mother's soft concern, my best friend's laugh, echoing from the shadows where no one should be. The nylon walls shivered as if fingers brushed across them. The faint scrape of nails trailed along the seams, circling me in slow, deliberate movements. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused. The flashlight trembled in my grip, but I couldn't bring myself to shine it. Some instinct screamed. That light would only reveal something I wasn't ready to see. Outside, shadows shifted. I caught glimpses through the thin fabric, shapes stretched too tall, bodies too thin, standing impossibly still with their heads cocked at unnatural angles. Every second dragged like an eternity. Sleep wasn't even a possibility. Fear rooted me in place, wide-eyed and trembling. I pulled my pack and gear tight around me, building a pathetic barricade inside the tent as if that would keep me safe. That's when the whispers changed. They stopped mimicking, stopped pretending. Their tones blended into something rhythmic, deliberate, a chant that pulsed through the forest. The words were twisted, ancient, but every repetition ended the same way. My name, drawn out until it no longer sounded human. The air inside the tent grew colder, pressing against me like a weight. My name carried through the chanting again and again, each syllable sharper, more insistent, until I felt it vibrating in my bones. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was something calling me. At some point, panic overpowered paralysis. My hand shot forward and clicked the flashlight on, the weak beam slicing through the thin fabric of the tent. For the briefest instant, I saw it. The silhouette of something crouched low against the wall. Too tall, limbs folded awkwardly, its head hanging at an impossible angle as though it were studying me. Before I could process it, the light sputtered. The batteries were dying, the beam fading in and out, each flicker threatening to leave me in total darkness. I shook the flashlight desperately, but it only pulsed weakly, throwing fragments of shadows across the tent. That's when the whispers changed. They weren't outside anymore. They were inside. They came from every corner of the small tent, brushing against my ears though there was no one there. Some sounded like breath on the back of my neck. Others like murmurs pressed directly against my skull. I whipped the light around, but there was nothing, just empty fabric and the weight of something unseen. Time stopped working the way it should. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. I couldn't tell if it was still night or if dawn had already come and been swallowed whole by the mountain. The air inside grew thick, pressing against my chest, making every breath sharp and shallow, and then suddenly silence. The whispers cut off mid-syllable, leaving a vacuum so deep it roared in my ears. My heart pounded loud enough that I was certain something out there could hear it. I strained to listen, every nerve pulled tight, waiting for the next sound. But the stillness only deepened, stretching longer and longer until it felt more threatening than the voices ever had. I huddled in the center of the tent, flashlight dimming to a dull glow, clutching it like a lifeline. My mind clawed at one thought, one desperate hope. Dawn. If I could just make it to sunrise, the world would feel normal again. So I counted the seconds, lips moving silently in the dark, measuring time by my own breath. Each inhale, each exhale, over and over, waiting for the first hint of light. When dawn finally came, it felt like waking from a nightmare I couldn't escape. The first rays of sunlight cut through the trees, spilling gold across the clearing, and just like that, the forest was alive again. Birds chirped as though they'd been there all along. Leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and the air no longer carried that suffocating weight. It was as if the night had never happened. But I knew better. Hands trembling, I tore down my tent with a speed that bordered on frantic, shoving gear into my pack without care. I couldn't bring myself to look at the trees. Couldn't risk seeing something still watching. When I finally stepped back onto the trail, I didn't look behind me once. Later in town, I told a few locals what I had experienced. They listened in silence, their expressions unreadable, until an older man finally leaned in and said quietly, "If you heard the knock, you're marked. They'll always know where to find you." That night, back home miles away, I woke to a sound at my bedroom window. Slow, steady, deliberate. The same knock. Some knocks aren't meant to be answered, but they always return. I always thought I knew what solitude felt like. I'd hiked, camped, and wandered through forests before, chasing the quiet, the escape from city noise and the endless hum of human life. But the moment I stepped into the Appalachian backwoods, that morning, a subtle unease wrapped around me like fog. The air was thick, heavy with a silence so complete it pressed against my ears. No birds sang. No leaves rustled beyond the occasional sigh of wind through the ridges. It wasn't just quiet. It felt deliberate, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, watching me take each cautious step. Locals had warned me in hushed tones about this part of the mountains. They spoke of old churches hidden deep in the trees, structures abandoned decades ago, sometimes longer, places where shadows seemed to linger unnaturally. "Some doors," they said, leaning close with their weathered faces, "ain't meant to be opened." I laughed it off then, a rational explanation waiting just behind my skepticism. I told myself these were just stories, folklore meant to scare tourists and curious hikers. Even as I set out, my eyes caught glimpses of shapes that shouldn't be there, hints of stone and timber in the green that didn't belong, almost like the forest had secrets folded into its layers. I thought I was exploring history, discovering forgotten places and relishing the quiet. But the further I walked, the more I sensed that some parts of these mountains didn't forgive curiosity. The air thickened, shadows seemed to stretch toward me with subtle intention. I had stepped beyond ordinary trails, and I realized, perhaps too late, that some doors in these woods were never meant to be opened. I thought I was seeking adventure, but the forest had been waiting for me long before I arrived. The hike through the Appalachian wilderness began innocuously enough, the kind of trek I thought I could handle with ease. Towering ridges stretched on either side, cloaked in dense evergreens that swallowed the sunlight, leaving the forest floor in perpetual shadow. The air was thick and damp, scented with pine, earth, and something older I couldn't name, a scent that seemed to belong to the bones of the mountains themselves. Every step felt heavy, the trails winding unpredictably as if the forest itself was deliberately confusing my sense of direction. I kept glancing at my map, but landmarks seemed to shift, moss-covered rocks appearing where they shouldn't, and familiar clearings vanishing like illusions. As I moved deeper, subtle oddities began to assert themselves. Trees bore strange carvings, symbols I didn't recognize, gouged deep as if by hands or claws that weren't human. Occasionally I stumbled across faint stone paths, half swallowed by moss and leaf litter, hinting that someone had walked here long ago, though now the forest seemed to have reclaimed every trace. Birds, squirrels, even the faint rustle of deer, were absent. The woods felt empty in a way that unsettled me. It wasn't just silence. It was a deliberate, suffocating stillness, the kind that makes you imagine eyes watching from every shadowed nook. Then, as the day waned and a muted glow filtered through the treetops, I saw it, a church steeple jutting through the canopy like a spine of stone. It was impossible, a relic where no settlement should exist. Drawn by a mix of curiosity and unease, I approached cautiously. The exterior was weathered beyond recognition, the wood cracked, paint flaking, windows shattered or boarded, yet it exuded a strange authority, an oppressive presence that seemed to guard it. Each step closer made the surrounding woods feel heavier, as though the trees themselves had paused, holding their breath. I felt that the forest wasn't just observing. It was waiting, and I wasn't sure whether I was being led, tested, or warned. The closer I came, the more the air thickened, each branch and stone heavy with the weight of secrets too old to name, as though the church had been waiting for someone like me to arrive. The perimeter of the church offered an unnerving first impression. Its walls stood stubbornly against the ravages of time, yet there was something wrong about it. The moss and vines clinging to its sides seemed almost deliberate, as if the forest itself were concealing it, shielding it from casual eyes. I circled slowly, every crunch of my boot against fallen leaves echoing unnaturally in the heavy silence. At the back door I paused. Though dust coated the threshold, faint footprints marred the dirt, shallow depressions that weren't mine. Someone or something had been here recently. Stepping inside, I was struck by the air, thick with dust, yet weighted with the residue of life that shouldn't exist in an abandoned building. The stained glass windows threw fractured light across the floor, but the figures within were grotesque, faces twisted in anguish, bodies elongated, impossible proportions that made my stomach tighten. Pews, warped with age, bore symbols carefully carved into their surfaces. The walls themselves were etched with spirals, triangles, and patterns I recognized from Appalachian folklore, protective charms, warnings, and marks meant to bind or repel something dark. A faint whisper brushed against my ear. I spun, heart hammering, but the room was empty. The sound could have been the wind, but the way it echoed, shifting from one corner to another, felt deliberate, like a conversation I couldn't yet comprehend. I forced myself to continue, moving toward the altar. There, a cracked Bible lay, open on a splintered stand. Its pages were yellowed, brittle, and smeared with unidentifiable stains. The shadows around me seemed to pulse and writhe, bending in ways the eye shouldn't perceive. I paused, a cold dread crawling up my spine. Then, it began. A low guttural chant, soft at first, barely more than a vibration in the air. It seemed to emanate from the altar, the pews, the very floorboards calling me forward. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet an invisible force urged me deeper, compelling me toward the center of the sanctuary. My hands trembled as I reached out to the Bible, my eyes darting to the shadows that no longer just lingered. They moved with purpose. I realized I wasn't simply observing this place. I had stepped inside something alive, something that had been waiting for me, and it wanted my attention. The lantern flickered, casting trembling shadows across the church interior as night sank, fully around me. The dim light revealed horrors I had only sensed before. Bones, some small animal-like, others unmistakably human, lay scattered along the aisles, arranged in patterns that made no sense yet felt deliberate, ritualistic. I swallowed hard, the metallic tang of old blood, or perhaps decay, coating the air. Every step I took sounded too loud, echoing as if the church itself was listening, counting, waiting. Whispers began to swell, faint at first, carried on a draft that should not have existed in the still air. But they grew, coalescing into syllables I could not comprehend, some perfectly mimicking voices I knew, old friends, family I hadn't spoken to in years. The sound was disorienting, as if memory and fear were colliding in the same breath. I spun toward the corners of the room, catching glimpses of pale figures just at the edge of vision. They moved with impossible grace, bending unnaturally, heads tilting in ways that defied anatomy, disappearing when I blinked. I realized I was not simply in a building, I was in a trap. Every aisle, every pew, every doorway seemed to guide me, along a path I had not chosen. I tried to back toward the door only to find shadows stretching impossibly across the floor, blocking my retreat. The air itself felt alive, thick with anticipation, aware of my every move. Panic coiled in my stomach as I felt the church breathing around me, pushing me forward, herding me into the center. At the altar, the Bible lay open, pages fluttering though no breeze stirred. The chanting grew louder, harmonizing with the whispers, a language older than any I had heard, yet intelligible in some primitive, instinctual way. I felt watched, not just by the figures, but by the building itself, by something ancient and intelligent, patient beyond comprehension. This church had not been abandoned, and I had not stumbled into ruins by accident. It had waited. It had known I would come. Every nerve in my body screamed that leaving was impossible, that the sanctuary had chosen me as its audience, and now it demanded my attention in ways I could neither resist nor understand. I bolted through the forest, heart hammering like a drum in my chest, but no matter how far I ran, the trees seemed to conspire against me. Trails warped beneath my feet, twisting in impossible directions, looping back toward the church as if the woods themselves were bending reality. Shadows moved ahead of me, stretching and contracting unnaturally, flickering just beyond my vision, always faster than I could follow. The whispers followed too, now a chorus, overlapping from all directions, taunting me, some soft and pleading, others sharp and mocking. I tripped over a gnarled root and tumbled into a side chamber I had never seen before, half buried in the undergrowth. Inside, the walls were carved with desperate warnings and cryptic symbols, some smeared with dark stains that might have been centuries old. A journal lay in the corner, its leather cover cracked, pages brittle. I flipped it open to find frantic scrawls. They watch, they wait. Do not call their name. Do not look directly at them. My breath came in ragged gasps as I read, every word echoing in the oppressive silence that followed. Then I heard it. My own name, whispered softly, then urgently, from multiple directions. I froze, every muscle rigid, realizing I could not tell if the sound was real or conjured by fear itself. The walls of the chamber seemed to pulse, closing in imperceptibly, the air thick and suffocating. The church, the forest, the shadows, it was all one living, breathing entity, ancient and aware. I scrambled to my feet, trying to put distance between myself and the chamber, but every exit led me back to the altar, back to the center of its attention. I was not fleeing mere timber and stone. I was fleeing a consciousness older than any human memory, patient and intelligent, guiding me, testing me, ensuring I understood my place within its dominion. Panic consumed every rational thought. Every instinct screamed to run, yet running seemed meaningless. The building, the forest, the voices, they were alive in ways I could never fully grasp, and I had become just another element in their endless watching, waiting presence. The first rays of sunlight cut through the mist as I stumbled onto a ridge overlooking the forest, chest heaving, legs trembling. The church, the one I had spent hours trapped inside, hunted by shadows and whispers, is gone. There is nothing but the trees, stretching endlessly, indifferent and quiet. Sunlight warms my skin, and for the first time in what feels like an eternity, I hear birdsong. The normal sounds of the Appalachians return, almost mocking in their serenity, as if the horrors of the night had been nothing but a fevered hallucination. I collapsed to the ground, numb, shaking, unable to reconcile what I saw or what I felt. Later, when I recount the experience to locals, they exchange uneasy glances, their eyes clouded with memory and warning. An elderly man finally mutters, voice low and gravelly, "Some churches were built to contain them, and some to lure you in." His words send another chill through me, a reminder that the forest holds secrets older than any living soul. That night, safe in my own home miles away, I drift into uneasy sleep. Yet even there, the distant echo of chanting threads through my dreams, and a voice, soft, patient, calls my name. Some places in the Appalachians are not forgotten. They remember, and they wait. The day I set out for the Appalachian backwoods, I told myself it was just another hike, an escape from the city, a chance to breathe in solitude and climb among the rugged ridges where sunlight filters through endless layers of green. I imagined quiet streams, birdsong, and the weightless peace that comes from being utterly alone with the mountains. But almost immediately, the forest felt wrong. The air hung heavy, each step muffled against a carpet of damp leaves, and the usual chorus of wildlife was absent, replaced by an oppressive, watchful silence. Shadows pooled unnaturally beneath the trees, stretching like fingers toward me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods themselves were observing every move. Locals had warned me, of course, cryptic murmurs about places where trees mark the living and the lost, and eyes that follow you even when nothing moves. I'd brushed it off, laughing at the old wives' tales, convinced I was just being cautious, not paranoid. Yet, as I stepped deeper, the forest seemed to tense, the silence growing heavier, almost intentional. That's when the first foreshadowing struck me like a whisper at the edge of reason. I thought I was following a trail, but some paths aren't meant to be walked. With every step, I felt the weight of that warning pressing down, a prelude to something I wasn't prepared to see, something patient and knowing, waiting for anyone bold enough to enter these shadows. The mountains weren't just terrain. They were guardians, and I was already trespassing. The hike began like any other, with the thrill of solitude and the quiet hum of the forest under my boots. The Appalachian wilderness stretched out before me, jagged ridges rising like ancient sentinels, their peaks wrapped in mist that blurred the horizon. Sunlight filtered through dense canopies, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns that made every step feel both alive and unpredictable. At first it was intoxicating, an escape from the constant noise of the world, a place where time seemed to pause, measured only by the rhythm of my breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. But soon, subtle oddities began to unsettle me. Trees bore carvings that were too deliberate to be natural, jagged lines forming crude symbols, spirals that seemed repeated in deliberate patterns, scratches that followed sequences almost like counting. I stopped more than once, brushing at the bark, convinced it was just another hiker's folly. Yet no other footprints marred the trails, no animal tracks appeared, and the forest remained unnervingly silent. Birdsong, squirrels, even the occasional rustle of leaves from small mammals, all absent. I laughed at myself, muttering that the forest had simply swallowed life for the day, or that I was letting old stories twist my perception. But as dusk began to drape its gray veil across the treetops, something shifted. The carvings seemed to point, almost guiding me, forming a pattern that led deeper into the woods, away from familiar paths. Shadows grew longer, and the air thickened, with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves carrying an almost imperceptible tension that crawled under my skin. Curiosity battled unease, each step pulling me forward even as the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The forest was no longer just a backdrop for a hike. It was alive in a way that felt deliberate, and I had stumbled into a trail marked not by nature but by something else, something waiting for those who dared to follow it further into the Appalachian's hidden depths. The trail led me deeper, twisting and narrowing until I stumbled into a small clearing I hadn't expected. The first thing I noticed was the stone circle at its center, rough-hewn rocks arranged with care, some cracked with age, others looking freshly moved. Around the perimeter, trees bore the same carvings I had been following, only now they were more elaborate. Spirals intertwined with angular symbols, deep scratches that suggested a deliberate hand. Some marks were almost eroded by time, moss creeping into the grooves, while others were sharp and raw, the bark still tender from the cut. The contrast made it feel as if the place existed both in the past and the present, a threshold frozen between eras. The air was heavier here, each breath tasting of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic, unsettling. I thought I heard whispers, soft and indistinct, coming from just beyond the circle, carried by the wind or perhaps emitted by the shadows themselves. The trees seemed to lean closer, and movement flickered at the edge of my vision. Not the casual darting of animals, but deliberate, purposeful shapes shifting between the trunks, vanishing whenever I blinked or turned my head fully. My chest tightened, and a gnawing sense of being watched wrapped around me, as if every symbol, every stone, every shadow had awareness, tracking my presence. I remembered the old Appalachian warnings murmured by locals. Some paths don't just lead you, they watch you. You are not the observer here. Panic rose with that thought, a cold dread creeping from my toes upward, yet something stubborn inside me urged me forward. Each step into the circle, each glance at the twisted markings, pulled me deeper into a secret the forest had kept for generations. Fear and curiosity warred inside me, but the symbols seemed to promise revelation if I dared approach the heart of this strange clearing. I pressed on, feeling the forest gaze tighten around me, knowing I was being led but not sure by what or who. As darkness settled over the forest, the world around me seemed to shift. The trees, once stately and protective, now loomed like sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching toward me with intent. The carvings I had been following multiplied, spreading across trunks that I swore weren't marked earlier, their lines sharper, more elaborate, forming patterns that made my skin crawl. Shadows began to take form, humanoid in outline yet impossibly distorted, their movements too quick and fluid for any human or animal. Every time I tried to focus, they blurred, vanishing into the dense undergrowth as if aware of my gaze. The whispers I had barely noticed earlier swelled into voices. Some taunted me with familiar tones, mimicking friends I hadn't spoken to in years. Others chanted in guttural, alien dialects that made my teeth ache and my chest tighten. I stumbled, over roots and rocks, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness only to reveal fleeting figures slipping between trees. Then I found it. An abandoned campsite, the remains of a small fire long dead, a half-collapsed tent, a few scattered belongings covered in moss. Someone, or something, had been here, and the sense of their lingering presence was oppressive. I turned, trying to retrace my steps, only to find the path twisted impossibly. No matter which direction I ran, I returned to the same marked tree, its carvings glowing faintly under the moonlight. Panic surged as realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't lost by chance. The forest itself was alive with awareness, directing me, shaping my movements, perhaps even enjoying my fear. I was no longer simply exploring. I had become prey, hunted by a force that existed long before the trails were carved and long after any human would dare remember. Every whisper, every shadow, every mark pressed that truth into me. This was no ordinary hike, and these woods did not welcome visitors. They claimed them. Desperation clawed at me as I ran blindly through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and cutting my skin. Every time I thought I'd found a path leading out, the woods twisted impossibly, returning me to the same clearing where the markings radiated from trees like silent beacons. The carvings glowed faintly under the moonlight, pulsing as if alive, guiding something, some presence, closer with every step I took. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart hammering against my ribs, as I realized the forest itself was a predator, each tree a watcher, every shadow a silent observer. Then through the dense undergrowth I glimpsed a structure barely visible in the darkness. An old hunter's shack, hidden and half-collapsed, yet intact enough to offer refuge. I stumbled inside, collapsing against the wall, my trembling hands running over the surfaces. Every plank was covered with frantic etchings, warnings scratched deep into the wood. The marks follow. Do not stray. Turn back or be claimed. They are patient. You are not alone. The words pressed against my mind as though the previous visitors had left not just messages, but fear itself embedded into the timber. Then it began. The whispers, soft at first from every direction simultaneously. My name, spoken in tones I recognized yet distorted, twisted around me like smoke, infiltrating my thoughts. I pressed myself against the floor, listening to the subtle scurrying outside, aware that whatever moved beyond the walls was not human, not animal, but aware, intelligent, and patient. I realized with a bone-deep chill that this was no mere accident, no lost path. It was a hunt. The forest, the marks, the shadows, they were all working in concert, tracking me, studying me, toying with me. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet every exit led me back. Every choice circled in on me. I was caught in a web older than memory, where the forest and its hidden inhabitants held all the power. The realization settled over me. I was no longer a visitor. I had been marked, watched, and hunted, and the chase was only beginning. When the first light of dawn spilled across the ridge, I stumbled out of the oppressive forest, lungs burning, legs shaking, and finally felt as though I had escaped its twisted grasp. The trees around me were just trees again, ordinary and sunlit, their shadows no longer shifting with intent. Birdsong returned, gentle and real, and a soft breeze carried the scent of pine and earth. I collapsed onto the familiar trail, trying to convince myself that what I had experienced was a hallucination born of exhaustion and fear. Yet deep in my chest, an unease persisted. The memory of the glowing markings, the whispered repetitions of my name, the unrelenting pressure of unseen eyes, these were not illusions. When I later spoke to locals about what I saw, they exchanged uneasy glances, hesitant to confirm or deny, their silence more unsettling than words. One elderly man muttered, "There's nothing there. Shouldn't be. But some paths mark themselves." That night, back in the safety of my own home, sleep offered no relief. At the edges of consciousness, I heard faint scratches against the window and whispers curling around my thoughts. The forest had not let me go. Some symbols in the Appalachians are never truly abandoned. They follow, patient and watchful. And I knew with a chill that sank to my bones that the trees remember who walks beneath them, and they never forget.